Welcome to CNN Talk. We're discussing the new al-Baghdadi video and asking the question whether or not, we'll ever beat ISIS, because Clarissa's here with us. And what we learned from the Sri Lanka attacks is that ISIS is still fully operational. And then we see the video. How do they tie together those two events?
Well, look, I think this is ISIS's response or their comeback from the collapse or the crumbling of the physical caliphate. You hear Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi concede that their victory was not to happen for them in eastern Baghouz, but that doesn't mean they can't inflict damage. It doesn't mean that you've seen the last of them. And most importantly, even with a $25 million bounty on his head, it doesn't mean that the U.S. has actually been successful in doing what it set out to do, which was to kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So they're making a statement. It's largely symbolic, but it is nonetheless important because it's significant to see that they can still launch large-scale attacks, that he is still in command of ISIS, notwithstanding all the violence, all the pressure, all the battles, and he is alive and seemingly healthy. I mean, this was the other thing.
Yeah. He looks almost stronger, doesn't he?
He's fat.
Yeah, there were reports that he was hit by airstrikes back in 2017, and so that took him out of action for a while. This is the first video we've seen of him, if it is indeed him, since 2014. We've had audio messages as recently as last August. But as Clarissa said, he wants to show he's defiant. The caliphate has fallen. It fell in March. But he wants to show that ISIS is still around, the ideology is still there, and of course, in the wake of Sri Lanka, the timing is very, very deliberate, and these videos are designed to recruit more potential jihadists in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa.
That's why it won't be defeated, because ISIS is an idea, and there's no idea in the history of the world that's ever been defeated by force of arms. I mean, Nazism still exists, Nazi Germany doesn't. So it's an idea, and until we grapple with the root of the idea, why the idea exists, there's so many tropes around ISIS. Someone in philosophy, to look at all the tropes around ISIS is just like blinking lights of why it attracts.
You would have looked at the video quite carefully. He's off camera when he talks about Sri Lanka. Should we be suspicious of that? I mean, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, initially I was suspicious, but there's a lot of other references to things that happened in that basically week period after April 13th or so. So we can sort of triangulate when it came out. I don't think it was just that he recorded a video with, a list of every country and was waiting to use it. I think it was targeted based on the news, and that's the entire point of it. But I do think that it's important that the caliphate has been destroyed, right? Because the entire thing that was supposed to be different about ISIS was controlling territory. And so that's what separates it out from a lot of other Islamist extremist movements. And so I think, this is a major defeat, and it's trying to rescue propaganda value from the fact that there has been a significant degradation of ISIS in the last several years.
But if the idea of ISIS was the caliphate, like you say, if it's the first idea that you'll have this piece of land, the land is gone, and that's a setback. But
Welcome to CNN Talk. You may well have seen some clips of the new al-Baghdadi video, the leader of ISIS. How can we ever defeat ISIS is the question we're asking you today.
A new ISIS video appears to show the terror group's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, alive and well. If genuine, it's his first known video appearance since 2014.
Since then, the terror group has lost all of its territory in Iraq and Syria. In the video, he talks about the Battle of Baghouz, where ISIS lost its final piece of Syrian real estate.
Off camera, the speaker praises recent bombings in Sri Lanka. He also claims responsibility for dozens of attacks in several countries.
5 years ago, when he appears in Mosul, he's appearing as the caliph, and now he's become a guerrilla. I mean, he's saying we've gone underground, and we're going to hit where we want to. We're not done.
On Facebook, Stephanie says, we can't beat them. There will always be people who will take the religion to the extreme. And El Mehdi also says, we can beat them on the ground, but we can't ever beat the ideology. Right. We welcome our listeners on Apple Podcasts as well. Clarissa's with us. Clarissa, CNN hasn't been running much of this video at all. I think we've just been running a still, is that right? But we've had special permission to run a section of it without the sound. If you can just... we want to give you the opportunity, really, to talk about what's significant about it.
So, I mean, if we take a look at this clip, I think what is very striking about this is his physical appearance, first of all. We've been hearing rumors he was injured. He's been killed, according to the Russians. He's been killed, according to rumors once on the internet. Well, here he is very much alive. He's significantly heavier than he was in the sermon that he gave in Mosul on the pulpit. His beard is gray with henna on the ends. One can only assume that perhaps that was in order to create a disguise to move around at some point. But I think what's really striking is the difference in the image between the man who we saw at the pulpit in the Mosque of Mosul back in 2014, announcing the creation of the caliphate, appointing himself as the caliph, and then the man we see today, or in this general period of time, who is wearing some kind of a military type of vest. He has a Kalashnikov next to him. He's basically, and you heard Bob Baer say the same thing in that introduction there, he's sort of rebranding himself. He's no longer necessarily the spiritual leader, he's the guerrilla leader, he's the insurgent leader. And that is speaking to the shift in ISIS's tactics as well. Okay, we may no longer be in control of the caliphate, but we can still inflict damage. And then, of course, during the video, he goes on to list all the countries where they are doing that.
Brian, we can also make this comparison, or people have made this comparison, and what do you make of that?
Well, I think that it's both of these figures here are people who ended up on the run for a long time, and I suspect that both of them will end the same way, which is that they will be killed. I think that Baghdadi, even though he's alive right now, I suspect it is only a matter of time. It took quite a long time for the U.S. to kill bin Laden. It was about 10 years since September 11th. And, you know, I think that point that you just made, Clarissa, is really important, that before he was able to go into Mosul, out in the open, he was able to proclaim the existence of this Islamic State. They were able to control territory. Now he's in a hidden location. They're having to obviously be very clandestine about it. And his political power is both weakened in terms of territory and there's infighting within ISIS. And so I think this degradation is significant. I think that's the thing that we need to focus on, is that there will continue to be a degradation of it. It will continue to weaken them. Yes, they will exist. They're still a threat. But I think that we need to focus on the fact that there is consensus in the West that this ideology is vile, filled with hatred, and has a shelf life. I do disagree with the idea that you cannot defeat an ideology. I think you can. I think you degrade it over time and its ability to spread it. And
I didn't say an ideology, Brian. I said an idea, which is different. I mean, you're absolutely right about the ideology. But again, I want to go back to the fact that if you look at these two pictures of al-Baghdadi, al-Baghdadi summons up 2 or 3 tropes that we've lost in the West or we've buried in the West. One is the resurrection of the king. Now, this plays out to people who believe this cult to be more than something of this world. This man has been gone for 5 years. The king has returned. It's a good idea. It's a great idea to have land. Land comes, land goes. But the idea of ISIS as the conqueror of the evil West is not going to go away. It's a boys' cult. It's about men. And that's what's so stunning about the work that Clarissa does. Because every time she moves in the space of these guys, you get to see what's really going on. And we don't deal with it. We refuse to deal with it. We keep thinking about it up here. It's not up here, it's in here. And this man, even his very name, it makes me laugh, al-Baghdadi. So all of this is part of the whole idea of men and boys, and that Islam, their perverted idea of Islam, and it's perverted, is an idea that will conquer the evil, decadent West. And it's not going to go away unless we understand that.
The optics are very al-Qaeda, of course, and we know that al-Baghdadi came up through al-Qaeda of Iraq. This is a low point for them, and they want to be defiant. They want to time this after Sri Lanka to put the fear literally of God, of their God, in many Western people, just as the death count from Sri Lanka is up above 250 now, mainly Christians, of course, with churches and tourist hotels being targeted. Look, not so long ago, before Mosul fell in Iraq, where he announced the caliphate in 2014, as Clarissa said, before Raqqa, the de facto capital of the caliphate, fell, this was 34,000 square miles. That's an area the size of Indiana. This is big, or Portugal, if you're watching from Europe. And now they have no territory. Now, Western intelligence tells us there are still 15,000, maybe 20,000 ISIS fighters still at large in Syria and Iraq, and they will come again. And that's why he's in his battle fatigues rather than his theocratic dress, because he's saying, and he actually does say on the tape, this is a war of attrition, the battle will go on. And because he's trying to recruit people, that's what this is all about.
It's all about signaling to his followers. This is not intended, really, for a Western audience. This is intended to try to boost morale among ISIS fanboys who have been reacting with some excitement because online and in the various platforms where they communicate, because for them, it is a big deal. It's been nearly 5 years that we have not seen any video of this man. It's been nearly 5 years that we've heard endless speculation that he may have been killed, he may have been injured, and there he is sitting looking plump and very much in control, casually looking through folders, referring to Sri Lanka, looking through folders being handed to him by deferential followers on his various wilayat, or his states that are, you know, his sort of franchises across the world, if you will. I agree, it's posturing, but to the specific audience that he's speaking to,
it's the religion.
It carries something.
It's summoning up, as Hitler did in his last days, which is interesting, the idea of the werewolves, the people who come out of the bushes now come out and do your work. So there are always the troops, and they're the hidden troops. So he's summoning up the ones who are now in the back and coming forth. It's totally mystical. It's a totally mystical idea.
These are the places he referenced in his message, Brian. What did you make of that? Because he's also stepping into al-Shabaab territory as well, isn't he?
Yeah, well, and there's ISIS affiliates all over the world. I mean, the Philippines and Indonesia have significant chunks. But I think that this global reach, one of the things that's part of this new phase is the returning fighters, right? Now that there is no territory, there are a lot of places that are going to have people trying to re-nationalize into the places they came from. So this is also a destabilizing impact, because there's countries like Tunisia, in a fragile Arab Spring, fragile democracy, that has thousands of people that are going to try to come back now that they have no place to be in Syria or Iraq. And the question, how do you deal with somebody who has a passport, who is legally a national of your country, but but may not be able to prove in court, has committed terrorist offenses abroad? And so I think that is one of the big challenges that this new phase, the sort of post-caliphate phase, will pose to both Western countries and non-Western countries as they try to deal with the security risk associated with that.
And the intelligence services are onto this, aren't they? They're very aware that, you know, these very dangerous people are trying to return home, and they probably won't be locked up because there isn't the evidence.
And yet what we see are countries that are politically hamstrung in how to deal with this, because you have a sort of Sophie's choice, if you will. Do you take these people back knowing that perhaps you won't be able to present the evidence in court to secure a conviction? Or do you say you're not going to take them back, as the UK has said, and enter this sort of bizarre legal limbo where you're no longer abiding by your own you know, liberal democratic values,
coup for your enemies,
which is then a propaganda coup, and which then alienates, you know, Muslims living within your own borders. So there is a very difficult line to be walked here. The other thing that is so difficult to know for intelligence and security services, especially when they're looking at the brides, the ISIS brides who are coming back, you don't know the difference between an extremist and a violent extremist. When is somebody crazy and when are they an actual threat, as in they can blow people up? Because security services don't have the resources to be just looking for everyone who might be radicalized. What they need to find specifically are people who are ticking time bombs, who actually might commit acts of violence. And that's a very difficult thing to predict.
But that's why I say ISIS is an idea, because ISIS challenges us in the West, and I'm going to use that term. It's old-fashioned, I'm going to use it. ISIS challenges us in the West to look at our norms, look at our institutions, look and see if they're strong enough. There are these very, very questions of citizenship, of nationality are Western notions. Are we going to adhere to them and then find a way to work within them, or are we going to react to the reality of ISIS and the security and all of that? And we're constantly, every day, being challenged. And we don't have the leadership. We don't have the leadership in the West to stand up and say, this is a Western value and this is what we're going to do. We're constantly on the defensive. We're constantly pulling back, fighting. And ISIS moves forward because it says to its young men and women, those people are weak, those people are corrupt, they don't have anything at the basis of what they are, so they can therefore change it and alter it because they're scared of us. And we have to make the decision of how we're going to hold up our institutions, but because we do have institutions. The young lady, the ISIS bride, who was not allowed back in. That was an own goal for British Security Service, total own goal for the Home Office. This young lady should have been brought in, taken to a safe house, and talked to. We don't know what the story is, but the fact we caved because we're scared.
Liam, this is what he said. If we look at a couple of his messages, this is what he says in reference to the caliphate. The Battle of Baghouz is over, but it did show the savagery, brutality and ill intentions of Christians towards the Muslim community. And that's a call to these people that have spread around.
It is a call. It's a recruiting sergeant. It's also an indication that this message is a tit for tat. This is in the wake of Sri Lanka, which itself was because of the fall of Baghouz in Syria, where the caliphate was literally on its last legs before it was overcome. I was very struck by this notion, which Brian mentioned, that now the fight's coming back to the Western world, as you have jihadist fighters coming back to their countries of origin, often in the West. That challenges our institutions. It also challenges our own social cohesion.
That's our institution.
It challenges the relationships between white Brits
it's the same thing.
And first, second and third generation Muslim immigrants to the UK and in the States.
It's the same thing.
But now Western resources are stretched, not just our moral and our kind of cultural resources. We're stretched because we're going to have to keep troops on the ground. Whatever Trump says, if you've still got 15 to 20,000 ISIS fighters at large in theatre where the caliphate was, but we're going to have to up our game too in the Western world as people come back and the intelligence networks and the ISIS cells spread around our cities and towns, threatening citizens living here wherever they originally came from. This is a call to arms to people he wants to recruit. It's also a threat to the West.
But it's also unbelievably hypocritical and lack of self-awareness in that statement, right? I mean, saying that there's the savagery and brutality of the West, right? This is a group, I think we really need to hammer this home since we're talking about this today. This is a group that rapes, enslaves, and murders people by the thousands, including fellow Muslims in their own religious community, including Christians, including these groups that are defenseless, that they have taken over. And I think as we talk about how it challenges our values, I do think it's important to underscore that we are absolutely in the right in this fight against these people, and that it is an absolutely morally bankrupt ideology. So while it may be effective for some extremists, for some people who are loners, for some people who are being targeted by it, this is an ideology that I think does have its days numbered because the West's ideology is better than it.
You're exactly right. But there is one point that he brings up in that message that I think it can be very dangerous, which is this idea that ISIS has tried to propagate. This is a clash of civilizations, that Muslims and Christians or Muslims and Westerners or Muslims living in Muslim countries that aren't under Sharia law, that they can never peacefully coexist.
Exactly.
And everybody who, lives, most people understand that that is absolutely not the case. But what happens when you have these escalating tit for tat, when you have what happened in New Zealand and you have what happened in Sri Lanka, there are people and forces at work on behalf of people like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi who want to create a wedge, who want to push things to a precipice where you can't row it back.
I want to bring up, because to that point, when he talked about Sri Lanka, he talked about crusaders. As for your brothers in Sri Lanka, they have put joy in the hearts of the monotheists with their immersing operations that struck the homes of the crusaders in their Easter.
This is a millenarian cult. This is a 1,000-year battle. This isn't about us sitting at this table talking about how we're going to deal with who's coming back. This is going to last 1,000 years. This is how they see it. We're at the beginning of this struggle. Until we come out of our bubble and really look at the way these people see this struggle, we're not going to defeat this. I'm going right back to what I said at the beginning. This is a cult. It's a millenarian cult. And this is the first part of the 1,000-year struggle, and that's how they see it.
Esther says we can and we will beat them. Feli says ISIS is a product of failed US policies in the Middle East. Have your say on our Facebook feed. Back in a moment. I mean, lots of people reacting to the images. I mean, that was... I mean, he knows that, though, doesn't he? And that imagery, how long would they have sat?
Well, I think something
imagery?
we can talk about as well. I mean, obviously, we're still talking on Facebook, but something we can talk about when we come back is what really struck me is it seemed like he hired a team of PR directors to choreograph this. I mean, literally, from like the cushions on the ground and the rifle and the vest and the tent and the. I mean, it was like out of Lawrence of Arabia or something.
Or Pasha.
Yeah. I mean, it was very.
Yeah. We are going to pivot to Venezuela.
Oh, you are? Okay, do you want to swap me out then with...
Do you want to swap out? It's up to you.
Well, I mean, I think you should have MPW on.
We would like to... You're most welcome to stay. We're going to have Nick in the newsroom as well. You're
going to have him in the newsroom, not on set?
Yeah.
Well, I can sit here if we're just going to...
Yes.
Talk generally about
it. So Juan Guaido is basically... we've got an image of him. Where is he exactly? Outside a military base.
My PhD is about coups.
There you go.
Is there any editorial of that? I'm like not seeing a single.
Should I send it to you?
Can you send it to me?
10 seconds. Stand by.
Pivot.
We're going to bring you some breaking news because Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, how would we define him, Clarissa? Opposition leader in Venezuela, currently calling for protesters to hit the streets. We're going to go to Nick because Nick's the expert on this subject in a moment. In the meantime, Brian, what do you make? I mean, I know that you've been following developments in Venezuela very closely. Guaido was under a lot of pressure, and his supporters were looking for him to make a move. I mean, what are you looking for in this development?
Well, what's really important when you have regime change talk and you have somebody trying to instigate it is whether the military defects. You see this in the Arab Spring. You see this in basically every time that there is a revolution or a coup, you need to get military brass on your side. So it's striking that there's a very direct call in the statement for the military to join him in the streets, to basically defect from their posts and join him. If that happens, it would be possible that the regime would collapse very quickly. But there's no guarantee that that will happen because there have been attempts by people within the Venezuelan military to call for that, and they have mostly fallen on deaf ears. Partly by design, because regimes like Venezuela, authoritarian regimes, often try to sweeten the deal for their soldiers to ensure that they will not defect in moments of political crisis.
Venezuela's Vice President of Communications has said, we inform the people of Venezuela that at this moment in time we are confronting and deactivating a small number of traitorous military personnel who position themselves to promote a coup against the Constitution. What do you make of that? So is a coup underway if the government's suggesting it is?
Well, I think it's obviously the government's going to call it a coup right away and try to quash it as soon as they can, whatever is happening. I think it's too early to say exactly what's happening. All we saw from the video that Guaido posted on his Twitter account were that there were some military elements with him. How broad is that support? How deep is that support? What is this going to look like? He called for people to take to the streets. Originally, protests have been called for tomorrow. Now they seem to want to get underway today, giving the impression that maybe there's a kind of hurried element to all of this. It's still very early in the morning in Caracas. It's
about 6.
Yeah, it's about
6 in the morning.
6 or 7 in the morning.
Yeah.
So
okay.
It'll be very important to see how the day plays out.
Nick, I'm just going to go to Nick, because Nick's in the newsroom. He's been following developments. What can you tell us, Nick?
Well, there are a lot of things that are different about this, Max, than what we've seen over the past few months or so. Yes, we've seen standoffs like this where Guaido calls people out onto the streets and they're met with tear gas. But today is different for a number of reasons. Firstly, because when he appeared, he appeared alongside a man who's supposed to be under house arrest, Leopoldo Lopez. Not in the pictures you're showing just there, but he was on screen just about they're shaking hand with another supporter there. That man's supposed to be under house arrest, and according to Guaido's supporters, got out because the military let him out of that sort of custody area where he was being held. Now, that shows certainly parts of the military not doing what they're supposed to. What is also different is we haven't seen Juan Guaido, the opposition leader who's recognised as interim president by dozens of other countries. We haven't seen him standing with that many soldiers behind him. A limited number, fine, but some of them are wearing blue armbands, which suggests they see the possibility they may need to differentiate themselves with other Venezuelan military they might be in confrontation with in the hours or days ahead. What's also different is we've heard from the Venezuelan government saying that this is, quote, a coup. Now, they've used inflammatory language a lot in the past, but using that at this particular moment does suggest they perhaps perceive the severity of this. Now, what Guaido has also done here is seemingly sort of light the touch paper of tomorrow's nationwide called protests 24 hours early. And there are two schools of thought about this. One, yes, possibly the opportunity presented itself and they decided to seize the moment early, but I don't see that happening here. Leopoldo Lopez's release from house arrest, way too complicated to pull off. That number of military on the street, not something you can suddenly do overnight. What seems more likely, and what we've seen them do before, is sometimes cause events that may let people out on the streets or inspire popular anger happening before those protests are supposed to occur, to ensure greater attendance, to ensure a reason for people being out there. You're seeing pictures there of that's Leopoldo Lopez actually being hugged there by the man in the blue shirt. A very striking image for Venezuelans. He was sort of the Juan Guaido Mark I, put under house arrest a number of years ago now he's out. This is clearly a sign that opposition, old and new, are congealing together and moving forwards. Quite what we see in the hours ahead is Juan Guaido making another address there, frankly a master of social media here, but somebody who's not managed to take his sort of international support into practical application of power inside the country. What's key in the hours ahead is whether or not we see these protests we've seen in the past get tear gassed, get met with a government force, and then filter away, their message sent that they're able to muster troops out on the street, or whether they stay where they are, whether people come out and join them. It's still very early in the morning on a Tuesday in Caracas at this point, and whether that kind of sense of popular momentum builds towards tomorrow's protest. What's distinguished these Venezuelan protests so far is they come out, they make a noise, they voice a lot of strong, good intent, and then after a number of hours, they go home. This is very different, though, because they're talking about the beginning of the end and Operation Freedom. The government are calling it a coup. We haven't seen military in these numbers, and really the point for President Nicolas Maduro here is, does he decide this is the moment where he has to use force and stamp his mark on the situation, or, as many say he's seen in the past, using force may actually worsen the situation? Is it perhaps time for him to see if this saunters out or peters out in the hours ahead? That's the key question. An incredibly volatile moment here in Caracas, and one I think, I have to say, I did not suspect. It did seem that Juan Guaido's movement was beginning to flag, but often they surprise you. They surprised us with his return to the country, which was done through a commercial airliner through Panama. Nobody knew about that. Everybody was trying to work out what he was trying to do, and he sneaked on the plane at the last minute and flew in, and nobody could stop him. Here, he's managed to get his kind of predecessor released from house arrest, appearing alongside him at a dawn photo shoot on social media with many Venezuelan military defectors. Those scenes there on the bridge you're seeing, Max, that is quite common in Venezuela. The flags, the tear gas, people on the street. What is uncommon is to see a Venezuelan soldier there you're seeing from what looks like the National Guard having a cigarette, hanging around with the protesters. This is a new part of today. You can see those soldiers there. They are armed. They are being tear gassed. They're not using those weapons to fire back. And I think this is the point of key interest today. Does this turn into another episode in the up and down kind of sine wave of Venezuelan resistance to Nicolas Maduro, or do we see some kind of element of conflict here which takes this to a much more regrettable, darker stage, Max?
OK, Nick, thank you. And also, we're going to be wanting the US reaction.
I was just about to say, it's 7:23 on the East Coast of the United States. Trump is up. It will be interesting to look at his Twitter feed. I wouldn't put anything past him.
And
he was in this.
And in the past, there's been, obviously references to oil supplies in relation
Sure,
to
I mean,
that.
just to say that which way the Venezuelan military goes has been the source of huge speculation. There's been a kind of proxy Cold War going on, if we're honest, with Russians backing Maduro. This is a country which, under a lot of definitions, has got the biggest oil reserves in the world, and yet ordinary people are dealing with an inflation rate of over 350,000%. That's why we've seen millions of people fleeing out of Venezuela in search of, food, medication, keeping their families together.
When it comes to the military, it's all about the military, surely. I mean, whether or not they all defect to the Guaido side, right?
There tends to be a tipping point in these situations. So if you get a few big figures from the military brass, then the rank-and-file soldiers will often follow. If the authoritarian regime decides to use live rounds on protesters, there will be a massive pressure for soldiers to defect because they did not sign up to kill their own people. Yeah. So it's a very fraught situation, but what tends to happen is, and it's exactly what Guaido is trying to do right now, is to bring people out into the streets to give the impression of a popular revolution and basically give the impression to the soldiers, you're on the losing side if you stick with Maduro. And if you don't defect now, there's going to be a real problem for you in Venezuela.
Watch Donald Trump.
Clarissa, you've covered many of these events. I mean, there is a tipping point always, isn't there? As we take in these live pictures, what's your final thought on what you're looking for?
I think what Bonnie said, watch Donald Trump, because the U.S. has taken a pretty aggressive, proactive stance in this conflict, recognizing Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. It is hard to believe that if this is the beginnings of a coup, it is hard to believe that he would be acting without the tacit knowledge of certain people within the White House. So it'll be very interesting to see, is the White House willing to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak? And if this does turn, well, not necessarily go in, but if this does become bloody, if this does devolve into some kind of an internecine conflict, how is the U.S. going to address that? It's one thing to voice support for protesters. It's another thing to actually get involved in a potentially bloody conflict.
We'll be following this story throughout the day. Thank you for watching. We'll be back again same time tomorrow.